Good evening. My name is Andrew Seri. I'm a faculty member here at Berkeley and the Vice Provost for Strategic Academic and Facilities Planning. And I have been asked to make a few remarks on the way to an introduction of David Zilberman, who will introduce our speaker this evening. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you to the Spring 2015 Master of Development Practice Spring Lecture. I said spring twice, I know, I'm sorry. Our speaker this evening is Dr. Raj Shah, who, as you just heard in the lobby, has stepped down lately from his position as administrator of the United States Agency for International Development. We are in a position, I think, as a community to thank Dr. Shah for more than a decade of support for the campus through his work at the Gates Foundation, as well as through USAID. Let me suggest that we do that with a little applause. Now, we were just talking before I came up to the podium, and I was asking about future plans, and I have to say they sound a little bit nebulous. It may be that the future plans could involve some kind of involvement with the university here. I'm sure our students would greatly appreciate that. So we'll see if we can arrange something that looks tempting. But the offer will not include any kind of promise about parking. The only way that we can promise parking is if you happen to have won a Nobel Prize. But maybe that's in the cards as well. So I want to say a few words about the Berkeley campus and global engagement. This is something which has been high on our radar screen for a very long time. Over the last decades, we really have become a center on the West Coast for engagement in all kinds of issues having to do with development, including challenges like social and economic inequality, poverty, poor health and education systems, unsafe water, inadequate sanitation, human rights abuses, environmental destruction, and the list goes on and on. We really have engaged in all of these kinds of issues from a campus-wide perspective. Every school and college has people working on these problems, everything from the business school to the School of Information, among professional schools, and among the academic disciplines, from political science to sociology to area studies, economics, and so on. We're all engaged on a large amount of research and translation to practice of all kinds of ideas involved with development. We also have wonderful centers on campus that work in these areas. I think about the Blum Center for Developing Economies. I think about the Center for Effective Global Action. Typically for Berkeley, we have a Center for Effective Global Action rather than a Center for Ineffective Global Action. And I'm sure you can appreciate that those abound all over the academic landscape. I want to say a few words also about our latest concentrated effort in thinking about our global engagement through the Berkeley Global Campus, which is something that we are planning for our property, which is on the shore of the bay between Berkeley Marina and Richmond Marina. This large piece of property is an area that we're looking to develop as a hub for research-oriented universities from around the world and non-governmental organizations and companies, all to focus on the grand challenges that really separate us from where we would like to be as a human civilization. So there are all kinds of problems we're looking to solve at the Berkeley Global Campus, from things like the economic equality that I mentioned before, or precision medicine, which can lead to much more effective treatments, to a whole host of diseases. The list is long. This is part of Chancellor Dirk's vision for the future, and you can be sure that a program like the Master of Development Practice will play a strong role at the Berkeley Global Campus. I feel very happy being here introducing Professor Zilberman in a moment, because I was fortunate enough to be, just the one would have been fine, but thank you. I see, vodka and water. I feel very happy. I feel very happy to be introducing Professor Zilberman because I happen to be serving as Dean of Graduate Division at the time when the proposal for the MDP was developed and submitted. And I remember reading, it was a page turner. I mean, normally, I have to say, academic degree proposals are not page turners. But this one really was. So much great energy and enthusiasm focused on such a terrifically important set of issues. And so let me introduce Professor Zilberman to you. He's going to tell you more about the MDP in a moment. So Professor Zilberman holds the Robinson Chair in the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics. His areas of expertise include agricultural and environmental policy, the economics of innovation, risk, and marketing, and water, pest control, biotechnology, and climate change. He's a one-man department, actually. He received his BA in economics and statistics at Tel Aviv University and his PhD from no less an institution than the University of California, Berkeley. So please join me in welcoming Professor Zilberman to the stage.
Okay, it's a real pleasure to have this meeting and to have Raj Shah in our lecture. It's really exciting to have Raj because he is a superstar in development practice, which is our field. Now, people don't know what development practice is, and when they ask me what it's all about, I say, look what Raj is doing, and that's development practice. Now, so our program in Berkeley celebrates its third birthday. We have 55 students, and we are building a unique curriculum with a foundation in economics, decision theory, management, health. But the key element is that we really emphasize practice. The name is not lying. We have a summer practicum where people go for 3 months, and generally we don't help them. They find their own practice. There is a lot of emphasis on basically students take an initiative, and they are able to do it. And then they have a keystone project that are really amazing. Now, a program like ours exists only because of the richness of the Berkeley campus, because we don't have any faculties that belong to us. All the people basically borrow from all over campus. It's a graduate group, and we are always able to find really fantastic teachers to teach our program. So I really want to thank everyone that is teaching for us. Now, the program wouldn't be really possible without George, who really does a great job running the show every day and advising students, and Eunice, who is really single-handedly runs our administration, admission, registration, and she has something very uncommon, which is called common sense. So, now.
And it's your birthday.
Now, happy birthday. Okay. I thought it was yesterday, man. Anyhow, okay, now a little bit about Raj. Raj grew up in Michigan and has incredibly fascinating resume. He started as a medical doctor and then got a degree in health economics, which it's really rare to combine economics and health, and I think that's what the world, and at least the US, needs. He was an entrepreneur from the beginning. He started a group, a group with several hundred students of young Americans that aimed to empower and build initiative. A consulting group, worked with FAO, got a reputation as a well-rounded, brilliant leader, and then another well-rounded, I don't know if well-rounded, but another brilliant leader, Bill Gates, appointed him to the Gates Foundation. In Gates, really what he did, he built a great organization that emphasized empowerment, technological innovation, and data-based decisions. After Gates, he moved to USDA, where during a short period of time, he initiated NIFA. NIFA is the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, And as someone that works in agricultural economics, I really appreciate it because it will be hopefully something like the National Institute of Health and bring some sort of more rigor to agricultural funding and hopefully more money. Then he moved to USAID where he oversaw rescue operation, developed on the alleviation of hunger and energy provision. Now, one thing that I really appreciate about Raj in AID is that he really invigorated the relationship between universities and AID. I think that one thing that I knew is that in the past, people in Berkeley didn't want to touch AID. And now they're eager to touch, and it's not only us, it's other universities. And I think it's really a Raj attitude. So I think that what I like to do is that we can really learn from Raj about what it means to be a development practitioner. Because I think that to some extent, I think his resume is really a good example of what you can do. Because his heart is in the right place. He cares about development and making the life of the poor better, but at the same time, he's pragmatic and opportunistic in a positive way. There are many people that really think about development in a very idealistic way and don't really reach far, but Raj, I think, is an example of pragmatism. He has observed a reality and make changes. He's changing himself all the time. He's not afraid to change direction and face new challenges, and he's reinventing himself. And another thing that I like about him is that he's not politically correct. He realized that that development is holistic. He's one person that speaks about development and mentions the military. Gosh, we speak about and mentioned about the fact that you need to involve all sectors of society. Corporations are not a dirty work, and you need to work with them. And development is really moving to new direction. I think it's really important because as people look at the field, a lot of times they have an idealistic view about what development it is, and generally this idealistic view makes you feel good of yourself, but do nothing. Raj is an example how being pragmatic and basically keeping the good sense of values, but being opportunistic, you can go very fast. And finally, I really appreciate Raj's friendship with Berkeley. He came here after he became the head of Gates, and he gave a very provocative presentation. He supported it over here, and I hope that he will be part of our future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very kind of you. Thank you. Good evening. Thank you, Professor Silverberg, for that very kind introduction. I don't think I'll be able to live up to it, so I should probably just end now and say thanks. Thank you also, Dean, for your comments outside and to the Vice Provost. I'm supposed to remind you all that there are comment cards. How'd I do? Okay? There are comment cards that you can write questions on, and we'll have a discussion after a few opening slides and opening remarks. I did want to note that I do have a long history of admiration and partnership for Berkeley in particular. I think I was last here as a guest of the Blum Center, and I just think that there's so much innovation in science and technology that's being applied to development through the Blum Center, and it's wonderful to see the undergraduates in that context doing some phenomenal things. It was also a lot of fun earlier today to meet the graduate students in the master's program and to see how they're extending that forward into another phase of their career. So it's truly an honor to be here and to be a part of this community. I don't know, did we find if Kate Gage is here, but if she is, she's our superstar leader at USAID. But when she comes, we'll give her a round of applause. And that's it. But anyway, I thought what I'd do is start by just reminding us that development practice, development work around the world is actually a very important part of America's national security and foreign policy, and in ways that people don't always recognize. This is a photo, of course, of young Afghan women who have voted in the last election. And sometimes it's harder to describe to people who are not as aware the extents we go to make sure that election processes, voting rights and access in fact, define real democratic transitions, even in very tough and very difficult circumstances. And that is as much a part of development practice as some of the other things that are more commonly associated with economic growth, improvements in health and education. This is a photograph of the Zatri refugee camp right outside of Syria, inside of Jordan. And I highlight this to make the point that, in fact, sometimes the gains and the contributions of a global development effort and of partnership with countries at times of real need are harder to articulate because the narrative is overwhelmed by the reality of crisis. So right now, if you were looking at the Syrian civil war and the reality of that tragic event, you know there are more than 11.5 million displaced persons, more than 3 million refugees. This was a camp that I visited back when it was a handful of tents and a little bit of gravel on the ground, and it was preparing to bring in 40,000 people. It now has hundreds of thousands of people. But the reality is, if the United States had not, and USAID and Treasury and others had not provided billions of dollars of loan guarantees, rebuilt the water system in Jordan to manage a 30% increase in the population, doubled the capacity of the school system in Lebanon to take in what was a 50% increase in the number of students that are now in those schools, and shifting to a double shift school system in some parts of the country, the impact of the instability of the Syrian civil war throughout the Middle East would in fact have been far, far, far greater. So it's hard sometimes to articulate that these development efforts have significant positive impacts on our security and our foreign policy and stability in critical parts of the world. But you can only begin to imagine what would happen if 3.5 million girls were not in school in Afghanistan, or if hundreds of thousands of refugees were not cared for in some context in Jordan, or if the macroeconomic stability programs we put in place weren't there and those countries had to deal with these massive economic and human shocks without the support of a real international system. That said, what many Americans see as development is in fact response to crisis, especially during a moment of emergency. And during my first week on the job, actually at USAID, we had the Haiti earthquake. That earthquake hit, and in an instant imperiled the lives, ultimately killing more than 250,000 Haitians and destroying Port-au-Prince. When Secretary Clinton and I visited Port-au-Prince 2 days after the earthquake, 21 of 22 public ministries were piles of rubble. The president of the country was literally walking around the airport trying to gather his government and operate it out of tents. The UN compound that would have been the locus and hub of coordination and management of a response effort had been destroyed, and the United Nations had lost nearly 80 of its staff. And it was a level of fragility and suffering that was quite extraordinary. But in that moment, the United States mounted the largest humanitarian relief program ever. Within 2 weeks, we were feeding 3.1 million people. Within a couple of weeks, we had clean water available, often trucked in from the Dominican Republic throughout Port-au-Prince. And while it took years to get beyond the tragedy, in that moment, we had actually the most successful in terms of lives saved urban search and rescue campaign with folks like this from the United States and from 56 other countries going through the rubble and pulling people out. And that was all on television and visible to everybody, so people, I think, could take pride in America's lead role in responding to that kind of crisis. What's less visible is what I saw just this past December when I went to say, okay, 5 years later, what's been achieved? And of course, as you know, development is a generational project, and the gains accrue incrementally, which makes it hard to illustrate what those impacts look like. But today in Haiti, the rate of children who die from acute malnutrition, the rate of children who have acute malnutrition is down 50% compared to before the earthquake. The rate of children with chronic malnutrition is down 30%. Crop yields for corn is up 120%, for beans is up 400%. The growth rate has averaged about 4.5% annually each of the last years since the earthquake, compared to a 10-year rolling annual average of just under 1% in the decade prior to the earthquake. And investment in the country, private investment in the country, is up threefold on an annualized basis. The gains take time, and this is a photo of an absolutely amazing hospital near Port-au-Prince run by Dr. Paul Farmer, a true hero to those that work in global health, that has enough advanced capability to take care of children throughout the spectrum of health needs. This was not far from the hospital. It's a company called Certeb in Port-au-Prince, where they now make tablet computers, low cost and designed for that environment, mostly for sale to the government of Haiti, which is putting the entire educational curriculum for students on these tablets and handing them out to students in school, and also for sale to other countries throughout Latin America. But the fact that they can have a manufacturing process and a successful business along these lines with trained employees gaining skills and earning income is impressive relative to where Haiti was. Now, one of the things that happened maybe 3 or 4 weeks after the Haiti earthquake was there was another earthquake in Latin America, an 8.2 earthquake in Chile. And it actually happened on a Saturday morning. And because our whole national security team was in earthquake response mode, we knew that we had to be prepared. So a number of us came in that Saturday morning, and the president called a meeting, and we were all in the National Security Council room talking about the earthquake in Chile. And of course, the needs for America's support were minimal to nothing in that setting, because Chile was not an extremely poor country, was not suffering from the fragility and the lack of building codes and the inherent risks that take place in fragile states like Haiti or Nepal or elsewhere. And in fact, we probably overreacted given that context, but it's always better to be safe than sorry. And I make that point because I really do believe that over the course of the next 15 years, people who work on development issues broadly, whether from a technology perspective, a democratic governance perspective, or more policy and investment perspectives, will increasingly have to focus their efforts in very fragile states, places like Haiti, places like Yemen, places like parts of Pakistan. And unfortunately, we took the codes off this slide, but this is the Country Fragility Index from, I believe, 2012. And while sometimes the colors evolve a little bit, you can basically see which states are considered, I think this actually might be 2011, which states are in the dark red and are considered fragile. I'll just make the point here that today, if you looked at the picture of extreme poverty, the people who live at $1.25 a day or below, the preponderance of that population, that's about 1.1 billion people, would be in middle-income, lower middle-income countries. 5 years from now or 7 years from now, when you look at that population, it will almost entirely be in these very fragile states and environments. And furthermore, if you look at, this is a map that is adjusted visually to account for population growth. If you look at where population is growing, it is also disproportionately in those very fragile environments. And then this is a map that actually illustrates rates of growth. And if you look at which countries are growing, and this I think is 2012, so it's a little bit dated. But the basic point is the same. If you're looking for countries growing at 7, 8, 9, 10%, they actually also tend to be poorer countries, sometimes post-conflict, and sometimes in the lower middle income category, that are generating that kind of growth. And to me, what that means is that over the next 10 or 15 years, we have a unique opportunity to renew our commitment to global development. When President Kennedy signed the bills that created the Peace Corps and USAID and made a major part of our foreign policy be the way we partnered with countries to alleviate poverty and improve living conditions for the masses in that context, he was doing that in the context of course, a Cold War and a desire to project American leadership and American values for a whole host of reasons. And I think today we're in a similar special moment. You know, we look at the world around us and we have an opportunity to shape the future in dozens of fragile states and environments that could go either way. They can either continue to be sources of instability, insecurity, very high population growth, and widespread extreme subsistence poverty, or they can move beyond that and be more stable, more connected to the rest of the global economy, more prosperous and more safe for our own national security. And I personally believe that for too long, development practitioners and experts have not really embraced the role that development plays in our national security, in our foreign policy, and we have an opportunity to do that right now. I'd also note, this is one of my favorite photos because I had to work hard to get this one taken. we were all in Tanzania together, and I was like, really, would it be that hard if they could just stand in front of the logo and take one joint picture? And I would like to say I'm grateful to both presidents for doing this. But the reality is, over the last 10 or 15 years, we've been experiencing a bit of a political renaissance for development. You know, development used to be, with all due respect, a somewhat quiet, under-the-radar line of work defined by, you know, experts at the World Bank and USAID and elsewhere writing extraordinarily catchy and hip papers about growth rates and trends and economies. But in practice today, development actually is a field that is attracting young talent, technologists, entrepreneurs. President Bush, through PEPFAR and the Millennium Challenge Corporation, dramatically expanded America's capabilities to partner with countries around the world to improve living standards for the poor. And President Obama extended that legacy, and during really, really tough fiscal years, continued every single year to increase American development assistance abroad, to increase our commitments to health, agriculture and food security, power and energy, and to do so in a pretty important manner at a time when almost everything else, especially domestic programs, were being cut. And some of the specific accomplishments of that engagement, I think, are worth reflecting on, because to me they do represent a new model of development that will define how we do this work in the coming decade. Our Feed the Future program, which was designed to work in 19 countries, I think is a great example of this new model of development. Feed the Future, in this case, this is a photograph of rice fields that have been planted with an improved product called Strasa, I think. But it's stress-tolerant rice for Asia or South Asia, produced in part through public-private collaborations and research partnerships between universities, companies, and the Erie Research Institute in the public system. And it is in fact true that technology can power transformation. Today, Feed the Future reaches 7 million farm households, 12 million children who live in those households who used to be malnourished are no longer malnourished or poor because they are part of those families and they've seen income and food consumption gains. Fortunately, we've actually focused on measuring those results so we can document those outcomes. And in what has been a real surprise to me, which I did not expect, but you will see this June some new data that will show in Ethiopia and some other settings, the rate of reduction of child stunting will have gone down by almost 4% on an annualized basis for 3 or 4 years in a row as a result of Feed the Future's work. And I frankly didn't think that was possible. I didn't expect to see such a rapid reduction in stunting because I thought it was a lagging indicator and would take some time to change and transform. But I think it shows you, this is one of my favorite photos because it's the orange flesh sweet potato, which is a beta-carotene enriched food product. And it shows you that when you bring science and technology to in a way that is consistent with the cultures and the manner in which people grow food, in this case, children consume food, you can see very significant impacts of these kinds of biofortified foods on health and nutrition and micronutrient nutrition in particular. Another trend that I think is transforming health, is transforming global development over the course of the next decade, not just technologies, also data. And it doesn't all have to be big data, cloud-based analytics. This is actually my favorite photo from any health clinic anywhere because it makes the point quite simply that we know there are a handful of low-cost interventions that if they reached every child and every mother would almost certainly wipe out preventable child death all around the world. Today, as we sit here, 6.5 million children this year will die around the world under the age of 5. Almost all of those deaths are in very poor settings, and almost all of those deaths are malaria, diarrhea, pneumonia, birth asphyxia, the inability to breathe because they're not getting suctioned and cared for in that immediate context, and neonatal infections. And if you look at, this is from a health post in Ethiopia, just the simple discipline of saying, okay, we know which vaccines, which interventions are going to be most powerful. Let's just measure coverage rates on a standing quarterly basis and make sure that our health system is pushing out to the most vulnerable children around the world and in our communities the right interventions. You can see huge, huge gains. In Ethiopia, through this system of better management, especially at the health post level, has effectively cut in half the number of children who die under the age of 5 in just 5 or 6 years. And it's extraordinary progress that ought to be replicated in context after context. One of the things we really focused on was making sure that we brought countries together to set the goal of ending preventable child death and create serious business plans to do that. And we partnered with Ethiopia, India. Today, 160 plus countries have signed the pledge, including the United States, to end preventable child death. Believe it or not, the United States has a problem, particularly in Native American reservations and communities here in this country. But by focusing on a data-driven approach and creating a business plan where countries say, okay, like in India, we're going to focus on the 132 districts that account for 70% of the kids who die, shift resources into that environment, move resources to the interventions at the top of the prior page, so that we're getting the most bang for buck. All of a sudden, you have seen globally a near doubling of the rate of reduction in child deaths from about 2.6% a year to just over 5% a year. And we can get this done. It just takes focus, management discipline, and understanding of the right technology, and I think increasingly technology that allows us to map and understand from a geolocated perspective where are the pockets of vulnerability that are not being served, and let's all hold ourselves to account to make sure that the $30 billion a year donors put into global health reaches those kids who actually die when they get diarrhea because no one's there to give them oral rehydration or basic supportive care. We saw the same in the context of the Ebola response, and I will make the point again that innovation and transformation makes a huge difference in the effectiveness of how we do our work in development and needs to be at the forefront of what development is like over the course of the next decade. This is the Ebola suit that was redesigned. I do wish Kate was here because I still don't see her, but she worked on this project. But part of why the health system fell apart in West Africa last summer was the health workers on the front line of treatment were the ones who died. Hundreds of them died in Liberia, in Sierra Leone, in Guinea. And most of them got infected taking off the protective equipment they were wearing while they were treating patients. And even more specifically, the majority of those infections came from taking the goggles off and having contaminated fingers touching the mucous membranes around the eyes. And it's partly because they had like 18 different components of the prior suit. It would take a good 20, 25 minutes to get out of that suit in a process called doffing that was a 32-step process that required multiple times being sprayed with chlorine while you were removing the suit. And we worked with a whole host of partners in makers labs in Arlington, Virginia, and with companies like DuPont to redesign the suit so that in the future you can get in and out of it. You certainly get out of it in just seconds and have a suit that actually can protect health workers and improve the quality of the response. This is a photograph of the first ever educational attainment assessment of Nepali children at second and third grade level, and a tool we developed called the Early Grade Reading Assessment, applied through basic tablet computing and done at large scale throughout the country, is providing us with basic information about our children learning. Is their educational attainment improving as we get tens of millions of additional kids, especially girls, in school? Technology, data, information on results has to be our North Star in development. Otherwise, you just don't know that even though something sounds good, you're accomplishing the result you seek. And finally, I want to say a few things about power and infrastructure, and use this also as an opportunity to describe some things that I don't think we do very well. So when we were going into the second term, President Obama was very focused on, every time we meet with a head of state or meet with business leaders in countries around the world, at the top of their list was the request that America work with their countries, public and private sectors, to improve access to power and electricity. And at a time when we are experiencing an energy renaissance right here at home, there simply must be a better way to enable countries to have low-cost, renewable, and effective and consistent power supply. And frankly, for the 500 million people in sub-Saharan Africa that still have no reliable access to power, we've got to be able to bring new technology and new solutions to that challenge as well. And a lot of what we did, I thought, was effective and significant. Frankly, I was skeptical that our efforts in what we called Power Africa would work very quickly, because the world's basically most power infrastructure over the last 15 years has largely been financed by China through a variety of different institutions and banks and export-import systems. And the United States and the multilateral development banks have effectively exited that business for almost 2 decades. They're now trying to get back in, and I think that's a good thing, but perhaps not as effectively as we'd like. And that brings me to an area where I think we struggle as a country and as a community, and it's in the area of financing and supporting the building of modern infrastructure in the economies in which we hope to have impact. Hi, Kate. That's Kate. Everybody give Kate a big hand. We did the Ebola suit, and you weren't here to tell the story. Okay. And this is a photo of a place called the Inga Dam in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And it is in the DRC today, there's about 19% energy access for a population of 80 or 90 million people. There power that does exist for the companies that are courageous enough to kind of establish businesses and try to employ people, they tend to pay 45, 50 cents a kilowatt hour for power. Hydropower at the Inga Dam could be produced for 3 to 4 cents a kilowatt hour. And yet, it doesn't happen. And there are lots of reasons, many people in this room, that could help explain why we as an international community don't seem to be able to support the development of modern and effective infrastructure to provide roads, power and energy, large-scale employment that reaches into construction trades and the lower quintiles of an economy and an employer base. But one of the reasons is the United States, the World Bank, and others have over the past decade simply walked away from infrastructure, energy, power, roads, bridges. And we do this poorly in our country, and we certainly do it poorly around the world. And I would just make the case to those of you thinking about what does development need to do in the next 10 to 15 years, that in order to really end extreme poverty, in order to really be as relevant to foreign policy and national security policy as we want to be, and I was talking about earlier, we simply have to get this problem solved. And right now, we're doing a particularly bad job of trying. And the most recent example of that is the fact that when the Chinese government created the proposal for an Asian infrastructure bank and secured a lot of support from other Asian countries, the United States, lobbied European partners not to join, lost that argument. Now everyone on the planet who's in development except the United States is holding hands to do that together. And we find ourselves sort of isolated in a relatively unique place. And we could get into in the Q&A why we land there. There's a lot of politics, some of which I have to admit emanate from, more, democratically leaning or liberal parts of our politics that are well represented here at Berkeley, by the way. But, these are not easy problems to solve. But if we don't solve them, I fear we will underpower our efforts to really get development right over the next 10 to 15 years. This is a photo of the Typhoon Haiyan and the consequences of that typhoon. I just wanted to make the point, as we talked about earlier, that increasingly we will see these kinds of major weather events wreaking havoc on vulnerable populations. The thing that we can do is use our preparedness to make sure we limit the consequences. And this is just a visit, actually, I think that's Chuck Hagel, our former defense secretary, visiting the NOAA facility in Hawaii that actually was plugged into an early warning system. And part of why that typhoon had fewer casualties than we originally predicted and expected was because they were able to effectively evacuate 700,000 or 800,000 people because they got a few days' notice ahead of time that the typhoon was coming. But those kinds of global resilience and early warning systems, I think, will be increasingly important going forward. So I'll stop there so we have time for a Q&A, and I'll use this as my last slide just to make the point that American leadership matters today and will continue to matter. And you're, of course, looking at folks who went out as part of, I think these were the burial teams and the Ebola fighters. But it was an extraordinary moment of American leadership. And there is no question in my mind that had the United States not stepped up and led a global effort to fight Ebola at its source in West Africa today, we would be looking at a much, much different global pandemic than dealing with the 20 or 30 cases that remain throughout West Africa. There's no other country that has the willingness to lead, the scientific capability, the diversity of excellence across so many different parts of American society, and a basic culture and ethic that allows us to put ourselves out there and do extraordinary things. And I would put forth that the fight against Ebola was a great representation of some of the best of America's values and science and capabilities. And if we continue to lean in to those types of opportunities, we can, in fact, make sure that development is a bigger part of our foreign policy in the next decade, that we successfully end extreme poverty, extreme hunger, child death that is preventable, and that we build the basis of our future security on stability and human opportunity, even in some of the toughest places in the world. So thank you for the chance to be with you, and I look forward to a few questions.
Water or vodka?
Oh, I'll take the vodka. You can take the water.
Okay, so if you have questions, if you could write them and pass them to the ends of the aisle. While you're doing that, I have a couple of questions that I thought I'd start off with. Here at Berkeley, we look at development practice and the elements of it from a lot of different points of view, technology, cultural understanding, et cetera, but we've also talked a lot about leadership, and you mentioned the word leadership, certainly international leadership. But I'd like to ask you to perhaps reflect a little bit on your own leadership style, and how that has had to evolve from the Gates Foundation. Thank you. I'd like to ask how that your own leadership style has had to adapt or evolve from the Gates Foundation to the Department of Agriculture to USAID. What are the elements of leadership you've had to rely on, and how have they been different in those different instances?
Well, that's a big, complex question. I don't know that I'm going to answer fully. What I'll say, I'll just share two thoughts. One is sometimes we're so committed to the great things we're doing in development or global health that we forget that it's also our job to ensure that we're building a basis of political support for our efforts over time. That's how American government works, and that's what you have to do to be successful. And so one of the things that I didn't really have to do in prior roles, but did kind of learn and hopefully do as the administrator at USAID, was just really go the extra mile to build that broad basis of political support and engagement. And sometimes that meant partnering deeply with very conservative, faith-driven senators and members of the House, whom I grew to deeply admire for their commitment to this mission. Sometimes it meant understanding when a crisis like the Ebola crisis is also an opportunity. The almost $2 billion that is in the supplemental request that Congress provided in December for Ebola will allow the United States to lead a rebuilding of the health system in West Africa, but also allow for really new and novel investments in agriculture and water and sanitation and connectivity and technological access. And you just have to understand how and when to build that broad base of support. The second thing I'd say, and by the way, I don't think we do that enough in development. I just think we get technical, we stay focused, that's great, it's exciting, but we forget that we have to bring along our politics with us in order to continue to have more power and capacity to be transformational around the world. Just the second thing I'll say, whenever I'm asked about leadership in general, I always refer folks to my favorite book on the subject, which is called American Icon, and it's the story of Alan Mullally's turnaround of Ford Motor Company. And without going into all the details, I'll just say that at any large federal agency or large corporation with a lot of distributed business units and leadership, points of leadership and accountability, having a focus on great process, great culture, management accountability, and humility to learn and adapt is critical. And I find I personally learn more from reading about Alan's story and then having Alan come to USAID and help coach us a little bit than pretty much anything else.
Thank you. A couple questions relate to the issue of development or response to disasters. One is, how could the private sector, or should the private sector, be involved in disaster response? Is that an appropriate role, or is that really more for governments?
No, I absolutely think you need public and private partners involved in almost every response. I mean, I just think from the first moment of the Haiti earthquake response, finding private partners who were able to truck in water from the Dominican Republic, or we actually struggled identifying people who owned construction equipment we could contract with so that we had the capability to do rubble removal. All of this work is public and private. Even in the context of the Ebola response, a lot of what our expert leaders do in the context of responding to crisis is procurement, logistics, engaging with the supply chain on protective equipment, in this case with Kimberly-Clark and DuPont and others that make the product. So you just have to have an open dialogue and systems that work, that touch both public and private institutions.
So two questions related to disaster response, one about coordination and one about balance. The question on coordination is the role of the U.S. Vis-a-vis other actors. I mean, there's been lots written on some of the shortcomings of different organizations, responsibilities, lack of coordination. How do you see that, and what are the lessons learned from Haiti, from Ebola, from Typhoon?
Well, I continue to think we all talk too much about coordination as if it's the kind of thing you can do from a top-down perspective. I mean, I've never been to a coordination meeting that I can stay awake in without a lot of coffee. And I kind of think the future of coordination or of collective action is going to be driven more by open data, real-time data visualization. You set a common goal, you make the data available to multiple actors, and you go after it. And a good example is the Ebola response. If you looked at when you really started to get effectiveness in the Ebola response, it was when we started to get, because we invested in the lab capability and but when we started to get a spreadsheet every morning that said, this is where you had kind of cases and districts, and you could say where are the new cases in real time. Then all of a sudden, a distributed response with dozens of different organizations trying to work together, they were able to be much, much, much more effective because they were all looking at the same data picture and responding to it in a way that was about getting to zero. No amount of sitting together talking about coordination could have achieved that outcome without the data. So one thing I'd like to see, and I know the Blum Center folks and aid data at William & Mary and a lot of what the U.S. Global Development Lab is doing at USAID, is I'd love to see just more open data, more real-time data, and more open visualized data accessible to all people who work in development and otherwise. And I have a little pet dream right now of a this is what I dream about actually, is a real-time data map of under 5 child mortality. We live in a world where you can crowdsource almost any observation anywhere in the world. And it seems to me like it should be possible to, within a short amount of time, just be able to have a really efficient and accurate map of every time a child under 5 dies, a light lights up somewhere on a mapping system tells you exactly where that happened. And once you start doing that, I'm convinced, hundreds, thousands of distributed actors that are all committed to global health will just become more effective at saving those children's lives.
Okay, one more question related to disasters, and that's about balance. The balance between kind of the short-term emergency relief and the long-term development effect in terms of timing. I mean, there's a tendency to want to do things quickly, which means maybe using a lot of resources from the outside as opposed to using local resources. On the other hand, using more of local resources might have a greater development impact. How do you strike the right balance there between emergency relief and long-term development?
Well, I think there's a different way of thinking about it, which is just what's the result you're trying to achieve, and how do you best deliver that result in a way that sustains. So during an immediate crisis, sometimes the result you're trying to achieve is, there's a large-scale famine in Somalia, and you need to make sure that hundreds of thousands of people are actually just getting basic sustenance and medical interventions so that, children don't die from lack of access to food and water. And so you do what you have to deliver that result. But in most settings, even when you're going after that kind of an emergency result, you can do that work in a way that is very sensitive to, are you investing in or discounting the local economy? So one of the things we did was help reform American food aid programs so that we buy more food locally. We formulate medically designed, ready-to-use therapeutic foods in those local settings, and have seeded companies that can manufacture and now sell those products to the World Food Program and others. That's going to create markets for farmers, and it's going to have positive local impacts while also producing the foods required to be provided to children in humanitarian need at times of urgent crisis. And I just think we need to keep thinking that way across everything we do.
Paraphrasing a couple of these questions here, you have a reputation of having come into USAID and being willing to shake things up. You have many critics, both within and without, for those changes, and many big fans. Part of that has been involved in putting greater reliance on local organizations as opposed to the so-called Beltway bandits. The critics say that is walking away from a lot of kind of existing capital assets and capacity, and opening the door to corruption and bad use of funds, poor use of funds. The fans would obviously say it's an integral part of empowerment and building local capacity. How do you feel about all that and how it's worked out?
Well, how I feel about it is I feel like the critics are wrong, and I've said this more politely previously, but if you're comparing the risk of fraud, and you're comparing a $300,000 grant to a local women's organization in rural Tanzania that is like bringing together women farmers and helping them aggregate their crop and sell it together and get higher prices and use those incomes. And you'd say, okay, well, we don't have, those women aren't spending $500,000 on reporting requirements, so we don't know that they're not stealing the money. That's a risk. There's some risk associated with that. There's no question. But to me, risk is when you do a $1 billion investment in Afghanistan in a war zone with a contractor who might have the ability to invest millions of dollars in the accounting and reporting, but everyone knows that's then being subcontracted, and within 2 layers of subcontracting, you lose all visibility and accountability. And then 10 years later, you learn something happened. That's a risk because it's scale of investment, it's lack of oversight, and it's a much bigger risk than those women farmers pocketing a few extra dollars, which they're not doing, And so, but they're just not. And so, but that said, look, corruption is always a real thing, but it's just as real in the federal contracting system as it is, amongst local organizations. And during my tenure, we suspended and disbarred something like 40 times as many organizations that were in the contracting system, including some very big ones that, essentially don't exist anymore as a result. And I just think we have to keep doing that and recognize that they're just, you got to have accountability in all forms of work.
A related issue in terms of USAID and the Washington establishment, the Millennium Development Corporation was set up as a way to, in some people's mind, to get around USAID and do things differently. How has that evolved during your term at USAID? And well, how do you see the two agencies working together in the future?
Well, in many ways, they already have kind of converged a lot. The MCC was created out of, in the mid-1990s, David Dollar and a bunch of other great economists did a lot of good work that said you get more bang for your development expenditure if you spend that money in countries that have good policies, good governance, and are less corrupt. And that's absolutely accurate. And so what happened after that was the World Bank adopted the Country Performance Index assessment and had reallocations to those types of countries that scored highly on the CPIAA, if I'm getting that right. And then the US created the Millennium Challenge Corporation to focus on those countries as well. Actually, when we launched Feed the Future, to use an example, we did exactly that. We said countries that are willing to double their ag investments, change the laws governing the agriculture sector to protect private capital and liberalize the seed sector and modernize their approach to agricultural production and trade, and countries that were willing to fight corruption and allow us to do these big baseline surveys and collect the right kind of data, were the ones we're going to work in. So that basic mindset of demand real accountability from the places you're investing in order to get more bang for buck, I think has broadly been applied in USAID, at MCC, in the World Bank, and elsewhere. My concern is, and I think that's a great thing, and I'm responsible for part of it in Feed the Future and programs like that. My concern is really over the next 15 years. I think the insights of 1995 are not going to be as useful if your goal is to end extreme poverty in the next 15 years, because you have to figure out how to work in more difficult settings with more fragile countries in order to achieve that goal. And you just no longer have a choice. If you want to really focus on countries that have high child mortality rates, high total fertility rates, you're in Pakistan and Yemen and Haiti, and those are not places defined by strong governance, as you can see. So I think the folks in this room and in academic settings have to come up with new ideas about how can we be effective and demand accountability and leverage, even in very tough places with very poor governance. And we just have to figure that out. And I think that's kind of a missing part of the academic discussion right now.
Okay, and perhaps one final question then about you and USAID. We talk a lot here about the need to embrace failure and learn from it. What do you see as your greatest failure at USAID, and what did you learn from it?
Well, so now I should really just ask Kate to answer that question, because she'll have a much longer list. The one that I'm most disappointed in myself in was the slide I showed about the Inga Dam, because I felt we had a unique moment in time when that I, as the head of USAID and the head of the World Bank and IFC and local countries and between US and China, had cobbled together about a $14 billion financing package for that project, and really couldn't get it even into a feasibility study kind of phase. And what I learned there was just that there are a lot of inherent challenges and misconceptions and politics that I hadn't been aware of, or I'd been aware of, but not aware of how powerful those politics would be, that just kill these things before you even get going. And my teams have often asked, did I feel I pushed too hard or this and that? And my answer is always no, because you gotta fight for what you think you're going to try to get done, and sometimes you'll succeed and sometimes you won't. But I remain convinced that if the Western economic entities and the Bretton Woods institutions are incapable of supporting much needed infrastructure to bring 2 to 3 billion people into a more modern and more fair global economy, that others will simply figure out how to do that without us. And that is going to have long-term, deeply negative consequences for our ability to project power and influence and connect with the markets of the future. And so that's another big problem that needs to be solved. But that's my top failure, since you asked.
It wasn't me.
Okay.
All right. I'm conscious of time here, so let me just maybe ask two additional questions, kind of composites of questions here. One, you already brought in the whole question of gender. Could you talk a little bit about that? I mean, a lot is said about that. There's a lot of, I would say, kind of nice words, and sometimes that really doesn't translate into the reality in organizations such as USAID and the others. You know, what do you see as the issue there, and as, in terms of development practice, what can and should be done?
Well, we should just be clear about what the goal is, right? The goal should be that whenever we're engaging in development activity, there needs to be a clear focus on and understanding that the benefits of those activities accrue to women and girls in particular. And then we have to be honest about measuring and assessing performance against that standard. So if you looked at, there was a huge increase in the number of children. 40 million additional children started to go to school in poor countries after debt cancellation after 2000. And everybody thought that's a great thing. Then when you started to measure, well, what happens when you take a school in Malawi that had 60 kids and it now has 160 kids? Who's learning? Are they learning? And what you saw was actually learning attainment went down, and it went down much more for girls than for boys. So I think we just have to be honest about when we measure results, we tend to not see results that are consistent with our professed desire to focus on outcomes for women and girls in the context of development. And so in our example, Feed the Future was designed from the beginning to be a program that honestly understood that 75% of total farm labor provided in the 19 Feed the Future countries are provided by women. And we created a very sophisticated tool called the Women's Empowerment Index, collected data. I was really excited when the first round data came in because I was like, we're going to demonstrate how brilliant we were and how thoughtful we were and how smart we were. And we did very poorly. These are tough problems to solve, but if you're not measuring the result and tracking it, you won't even know that you need to get better and try new things and do things more effectively.
Okay. Maybe one last question then kind of gets back to the whole question of, you talked earlier about kind of security and issues like that. How can the development community, the development practitioners, help the military do good development? Or is that really the role? I mean, how do you see the military and development working constructively together?
Well, again, as I noted, I said that over the next 15 years, the fight to end extreme poverty is going to be in settings that are characterized by instability and insecurity as much as other social consequences. And so I believe there's a big opportunity for people that care about development and know about development to partner with those security-oriented agencies, including the militaries around the world, to figure out new ways to address those kinds of challenges. And I know that's controversial, but if you're in certain parts of Pakistan or certain parts of Yemen or certain parts of Afghanistan, it's just the reality that we did some interesting mapping in the Sahel with USAID and the Special Forces Command. And what you saw there was after Libya collapsed, the trade of guns, drugs, and humans was throughout West Africa correlated almost exactly to the biggest pockets of extreme poverty and weak governance, and especially in the Sahel mapped also to where water and food insecurity was most acute. And one of my favorite moments from that study was Bill McRaven, who, if any of you have met Admiral McRaven, he was the gentleman who was credited with kind of successfully executing the Osama bin Laden raid, and he ran special forces, and he's like 6 feet 8 inches tall and looks like the guy who got Osama bin Laden. And so we're sitting next to each other and hearing this report, and he's saying, and we're looking at a map of 16 countries in the Sahel, and it's all lit up based on these different indicators. And he's like, well, I think we need to all make the case that we need better and more family planning programs in these red areas, and we need more agricultural investments in these bluish areas. And why isn't that happening? We should have a couple $2 billion extra to do that seriously, because this is an important security investment. And I think we just have to, and a lot of folks would say, oh, well, I don't know that we want a military person talking that way. I think we absolutely do. And we got to figure out how to work hand in hand to make this happen in some really difficult parts of the world.
So maybe we can just kind of move some of that Pentagon budget kind of.
I don't think he was volunteering the Pentagon budget. Yeah. I did ask.
All right, listen, I want to apologize to all of you. These are absolutely fantastic questions that I'm going to use for next year's Master in Development Practice curriculum. So I want to thank you for making my work a lot easier. And I will ask the last question, because there's been a lot of talk, a lot of speculation. It starts, it's kind of, again, about you. One person in the audience said, if you had the call this evening from Mrs. Clinton, Secretary Clinton, and said, Raj, we're a great team. Would you be my Secretary of State? Would you respond?
I'd be very worried if she's making those calls right now. It's a long road. It's a long road. I'll tell you what. Let me close on a different note. I really believe this, and I think it's important. If I've learned one thing, and Hillary would say this over and over and over and over again, that we take for granted, because we're all really focused on doing good, we take for granted that everyone should just support us in this effort. And I think one of the things that all the students in the development program should really think more about is whether we're all doing enough to build support in our communities, in our politics, amongst our business leaders, in faith institutions, amongst technologists and entrepreneurs, to really make this cause and this mission a big part of how America projects power and values around the world in the next 10 to 15 years. And I hope you all understand that your work inspires people. It really does. And I saw it for years. And I just want to encourage you to talk about it and to reach out to folks who maybe know less about what you're doing, and just constantly try to broaden the community of people that find kind of sustenance and value in this form of service, because as you know, it's very rewarding, and that's what it's going to take to succeed. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you all very much for coming. We look forward to seeing you at our next semester MDP speaker event. Thank you.